Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the Delhi edition of today's newspaper and analyze the important articles which have appeared in the newspaper for the day. So if we take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for, today in total we are going to have a discussion for around 10 different topics, few of them relevant in a detailed discussion for your mains examination and few of them relevant for your prelims examination. So here, glacial lakes multiply in the region of Himachal and Tibet. Now, why is that the case and what is the impact of that? That is something that we are going to study about. This is going to be relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as for your GS paper 3. Then after that, hidden dangers of irrational use of antibiotics on microbiome. This is talking about that increased amount of antibiotics usage leads to a different kind of impact on our own body system in such a way that the various different small microbes, beneficial microbes in our body, they get impacted and overall the human health suffers an impact. So this is relevant for your GS paper 3. Then after that, record temperatures in Great Barrier Reef lead to another instance of bleaching, and we have basically been observing this high range of temperature since 1900s. So that is something which has appeared in the science section. This is again relevant for your GS3. Then, will Saudi's new law aid migrant workers? Now, the new law for the migrant domestic workers have been passed by the Saudis. Now, how will it impact a country like India, which by various different data records has got the largest amount of people working as migrant domestic workers in Saudi Arabia? So what is that new law? What is the problem with the existing kafala system, etc.? That is something we are going to study, relevant for your GS2 and also for your GS paper 3. Then, how will Sheikh Hasina's exit impact India? Now, this is an article in the continuum of the various different articles which have appeared from the time that the Bangladesh crisis has emerged, relevant for your GS paper 2. And some of the articles relevant for your prelims: why are India's Gaganyatris going to the International Space Station? Then Ministry of External Affairs and NSIL signed pact to assist launch of Nepal-built satellite. Neelakurinji declared as vulnerable in the IUCN Red List. This is something from the international edition. And then a deep drill core gives new insights into the mantle. For the first time, significant amount of rock samples have been extracted from the depth of the region of the mantle. So thereby you have a greater idea about and many new possibilities which have come to the fore. We shall be discussing them briefly. Gene responsible for prickles in eggplants have been identified. So as per the CRISPR technology. So these are the articles that we are going to hold a discussion for, starting with the first article of the day. Now this article talks about the influence of climate change in the vulnerable Himalayan ecosystem, and at the same time how this poses a disaster risk in these critical and fragile mountainous regions. Now it talks about that the glacial lakes multiply in Himachal and in Tibet, and that poses threat to lives and infrastructure downstream. Now here, one has to understand that what do we mean by glacial lakes? When you hear the term glacial lakes, what are they? So in any mountainous or high altitude region, when you have the movement of snow and ice at a very slow pace, let's suppose you consider this mountainous ecosystem. Now here, this is ice covered and snow covered. So very slow movement of ice under the influence of gravity leads to the movement of the glaciers, and the glaciers eventually end up moving downstream. But sometimes the melt water tends to accumulate, and that melt water ends up accumulating, leading to the formation of small water pools, which we refer to as these glacial lakes. Now in the region of Himalayas, we have the condition where you have increased amount of warming. And global warming and climate change is impacting the region of Himalayas quite significantly so. So when we talk about the region of the Himalayas, here in the region of the Himalayas, increased heating has led to what? Increased heating has led to the not only the melting of the glaciers, but also the retreat of the glaciers. What do we mean by that? Let's suppose earlier the glaciers would melt after reaching this particular elevation. But because of the overall rise in temperature, now the glaciers are melting somewhere in this region itself, right, at a greater elevation. So that means you have increased melting. Increased melting, right, and also increased retreat of the glaciers. Retreat of glaciers. Now, because of these two conditions, there is creation of these glacier lakes. Now, these glacier lakes, if you will observe here carefully, then in this image, so many of the times you can extract much greater detail from the image itself. If you observe this image carefully, you will observe that there are some sort of depositional features all around it. Some sort of depositional features are present all around it. Now, these are basically the depositions which have been created by the glaciers earlier. These are the moraines, glacial moraines. Okay. So, the glacial lakes, they are basically surrounded by these moraine-like structures. They are known as the glacial moraines. Now, when there is an increased rate of melting and the glaciers are disappearing from the region of the Himalayas, from the region of the Trans-Himalayas, in the Tibetan area, from all this area, the glaciers are retreating and vanishing due to heat. The size of these glacial lakes are increasing. Now, understand that it will have various different consequences, but what the article focuses upon is when you have a large amount of these glacial lakes. Now, imagine if, let's suppose from here, from this portion, the rock is to fall off and disintegrate and fall into the water body. What will that lead to? Immediately, all this water will be splashed over. All this water will be splashed over and will start moving downstream. And that is when it can cause events such as outburst floods, what is also referred to as glacial lake outburst floods. Outburst floods, or in acronym GLOFs. So, more amount of these glacial lakes means there is a greater probability of these GLOFs happening, because eventually, slowly and steadily with warming, the amount of water will continue to increase. As the amount of water will continue to increase, it will induce more pressure on these moraine-like structures. And it can happen that these moraine-like structures can pave way under the huge pressure or can simply disintegrate. Now, when that much amount of water starts coming from the top of the hill, it will acquire immense amount of speed, and that speed will allow it to carry large amount of boulders, rocks, and everything and anything which lies in its way. Eventually, all that will come downstream and it can have devastating impacts, such as, let's suppose, inducing a landslide or any other kind of mass movement, rock falls. And imagine this water coming from the top of the mountain with such a high speed, it can always induce these rocks to come down on the settlements nearby, on the infrastructure nearby, causing loss of life and property as well. We have been experiencing these GLOF events in our country for quite a long time. Recently, you had the events in Sikkim which made a lot of news headlines, but before that also, you have multiple of these GLOF events in the region of Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Jammu Kashmir, etc. Now, that is what this study is basically based upon, which talks about the fact that in the study has been carried out across the Satluj river basin. Now, I hope we are all aware that Satluj River originates close to Lake Mansarovar in the Tibetan region near the Kailash ranges. Now, from there, River Satluj travels through the region of the Trans-Himalayas in the Tibetan area, enters India through the Shipkila Pass in Himachal Pradesh, and then moves into India and then to Pakistan. Now, that is the Satluj River across which this study has been carried out. It has been found out that not only across the Satluj River basin but also in its vicinity, the number of glacial lakes have been increasing and the sizes of them also vary. Few of these glacial lakes which have been created are to the size of many hectares, which tells you the enormity of water that they hold. So, the impact of it can be devastating, but what is more worrying is that not only are the glaciers disappearing, at the same time, they are disappearing in the region of the Great Himalayas and the Trans-Himalayas, due to which the river systems in our country can get impacted. And the northern plains, which are typically in the downstream of these regions, they can be vulnerable to these impacts. So, here when we take a look at its impact, now impact due to glacial lakes, let's suppose, when we talk about the glacial lakes. And the other impact we can classify is an impact because of melting, increased melting. So, let us understand what will be the impacts thereby. The first impact due to the glacial lake. Now, we have seen that as more and more glacial lakes will be there will be a greater probability of floods downstream, there will be a greater probability of destruction. So, more GLOF events will happen with a greater frequency. Other than that, destruction of life and property, right? Other than that, these glacial lakes can induce avalanches and landslides, etc. Right? They can basically induce the movement of these large rocks and these large boulders sliding down the mountain slopes, causing immense amount of damage. That can lead to the slope weakening as well, where the hill slope is not that consolidated anymore, and for a long period of time it can have cascading impact. For example, when the cloudburst event occurred in Kedarnath on 15th and 16th of June 2013, now at that point of time it was a cloudburst event in a mountain which can be devastating. But what made that event catastrophic was the fact that excessive amount of rainfall in the high areas, in the reaches higher of the Kedarnath, that is where you had a glacial lake. And that glacial lake simply overflowed. It breached the moraine structure which was storing it. And that is when all the water came down the valley, and that is when the force that the water had immediately increased the water flow in the river Mandakini, and Mandakini flowed and to such an extent that almost the entire valley was covered, leading to wiping out of the settlements in the region. So that tells you that one glacial lake, maybe not that large in size, can have an impact much greater in terms of its magnitude and multiplied significantly. Now, the other impact. We do know that these glaciers are melting and the glaciers are retreating at a very fast pace. Now, one of the reasons, by the way, why they are melting is because of the climate change and global warming. Other reason is because increased pollution in the region of northern India. That pollution is releasing small amounts of carbon compounds, black carbon, or what is known as soot. So that black carbon or soot, black in color, hence the name, these are very small particles. Now, these carbon compounds, they start getting deposited in the glacial regions, in the ice on the mountains. Now, the glacial ice, which is white in color, now whitish structure means that they would reflect all the sunlight. But on top of it, if you have these black settlements, now settlements of what? Settlements of carbon compounds. So on top of that, if you have these black carbon deposits, they will start absorbing more amount of sunlight. So more sunlight is being absorbed now by these icy areas as compared to the sunlight which is reflected back, as a result of which you have accelerated rate of melting. So due to global warming, one of the impact leading to melting, another due to pollution. So these are the two reasons for increased melting. So I'll write the reasons here for better revision. One is global warming and the other is basically impact or pollutants on glacial ice, that is black carbon. Okay. Now, this increased melting, what can be its consequences? In the immediate short run, and listen to this very carefully, in the immediate short run, you will have the case where the river flow will increase. The water in the river flow will increase, causing floods in various areas. But in the long run, now that the glacial ice would have completely melted, let's suppose 500 years from now, all the glacial ice, let's suppose, has melted, or 500 years is a very long timeline. It can happen in 100 years also, given the rate of warming that we are looking at. So when all the glacial ice has melted, that means the river flow of the Himalayan region will be dependent completely on the amount of rainfall received. And Himalayas, they don't receive particularly very high amount of rainfall. But nonetheless, those rivers will end up becoming seasonal. So Brahmaputra, Ganga, Indus, these river basins, they will have very low amount of water flow when the glaciers completely melt. And that can always lead to water scarcity in the entire northern plains and the region of northern India. So here, the impact is, one will be in the short run, floods, short run, there will be floods, and in the long run, there will be seasonality of the rivers. Rivers will become seasonal and hence you will have water scarcity. Because take the example of the rivers of peninsular India, southern India. Now all the rivers in peninsular India, they are dependent on rainfall. It is not because of melting of ice or snow. Now there you will observe that almost all the major river disputes that the country is facing is basically in the peninsular rivers, majority of them. Why? Because you have significant amount of water scarcity during the dry season. India is a country which does not receive rainfall throughout the year. You will have rainfall during those 3 to 4 monsoonal months, and after that it is comparatively dry. So that is why you will basically observe water scarcity prevalent across the country once the glaciers melt. Other than that, another major impact which can be observed is the fact that when the glacial ice completely disappears or when the rate of melting is high, the ice will start to thin out. As a result of that, the bare rocks of the mountains will then be exposed to sunlight. Now the bare rocks, the barren rocks, they will absorb more sunlight as compared to ice. Ice being whitish in appearance will reflect sunlight, absorb less. So when you absorb less, temperature is low. But the bare rocks will absorb more sunlight, darker in appearance. So the temperature will be high. So increased temperature or increased absorption of sunlight and that increased absorption of sunlight due to melting of ice, right? And that will lead to what? Further increase in temperature. increase in temperature. And once the temperature increases, it will fuel back the cycle and it will further induce greater amount of melting. So it will be a natural feedback cycle which will be generated here. So that is the impact of the glacial melt and the increased formations and presence of GLOFs in the region. So what is it that we have seen in this article? What are glacial moraines? What are glacial lakes? What is the condition of a GLOF? How is that initiated? And more formation of these glacial lakes in the Himalayan region is being observed in the Trans-Himalayas and other regions of the Himalayas as well. What will be the impact for the creation of more glacial lakes and what will be the impact due to increased melting? UPSC has asked a question regarding this multiple times in the mains examination. It has repeated this area, particularly the aspect associated with the water scarcity created due to the increased level of melting. Because largely the perception built by the candidates has been that glaciers will melt, ice will melt, so it will always lead to water surplus. But that will be sustained only as long as the ice continues to melt. There will come a time when all the ice will be lost and then you will have water scarcity. So this is a region which is very important for your exams. Let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the formation of glacial lakes and the impact on them due to climate change. So here 15 marker, 250 words. So in the introduction, talk about what do you understand by the glacial lakes. So glacial lakes are small accumulation and small water bodies created at the foothills of the moving glacier due to the melt water accumulated from the glacier or the melt of the glacial ice. That will be your introduction. Now, immediately into the body you move. Introduction should not be very large. Please don't write 50 words introduction or 60 words introduction. Not required. Immediately move into the body and start talking about that these glacial lakes, they are surrounded by the moraine-like structures. Draw a kind of an image there. Okay? Draw a kind of reference image, a basic reference image of the glacial lakes, and then start explaining that these glacial lakes, when they are increasing in number due to increased melt, that can induce a greater probability of floods and the breach of the moraine structures happening, leading to much greater devastation. And then after that, talk about the impact due to climate change. So talk about the fact that how the increased melt is leading to increased amount of absorption of solar rays, which is further accelerating the melt, and then talk about that how the more water in the glacial lakes, the more dangerous it is, and give the examples of Sikkim, Uttarakhand, etc. Now, because it is a 15 marker question, thereby you can also have the scope for talking about water scarcity situation very briefly in the end portion of your body. Talk about the fact that why this increased melt is happening, that also you can fit in here, but do that in a kind of a bubble manner. Draw these bubbles as reasons, right? Reasons for increased melt. Draw a couple of bubbles, not occupying larger space and indicating to the evaluator that you know this also, and it will be much more presentable as well. After that, eventually, talk about the condition of the water scarcity, maybe in a flow chart, maybe in a simple image or of a line diagram, and then reach the conclusion that this can lead to the destruction of the fragile ecosystem in the Himalayas. So the need of the hour is not only to limit the level of global warming, but at the same time reduce the amount of pollution in the northern part of the country. Otherwise, the natural frontiers that India has, that is the Himalayas, will be at a risk of a complete loss. And that is how you can finish the entire answer. Try writing it on your own and improve the practice. Now, another article in the science section, hidden dangers of irrational use of antibiotics on microbiome. Now here microbiome which is referred to, it talks about the various different beneficial microorganisms that we have in our body structure. For example, when we talk of our own human body, now the human body is made up of cells. Now human body also have many of the microbes, bacterial organisms, etc., which are beneficial to us. For example, you have various different organisms present in our digestive tract, particularly in the region of the small intestine and intestine in general, where that helps in digestion of the food and also secretion of some of the very required vitamins such as vitamin K, some aspects of B vitamins, etc. So that is the aspect of microbiome. So microbiome referred to here is basically the beneficial microbes, right, which are beneficial to the body. Now, that is where our body has got large amount of these microbial structures and microbial species going into many millions. Now, when we talk about antibiotics, why do you consume? Let's suppose you are suffering from fever or a kind of a disease or kind of an infection. That is when you take the antibiotics upon prescription. But what has been happening rampantly for the past many decades now is in many of the developing countries in particular, but it is not only restricted to the developing countries, even in developed countries, due to very poor doctor to patient ratio, that for a patient you don't have the adequate number of doctors. So poor doctor to patient ratio, rising cost of the medicines and Medicare in general, poor insurance coverage. Due to these factors, people are not relying on the doctors anymore. So when they fall ill, and you would have seen that in your locality as well, maybe in your family as well, many of the people, when they suffer from the slightest of cough and cold, or when they suffer from a simple fever, they start popping in antibiotics. Now these antibiotics, they develop an antimicrobial resistance in your body. So as a consequence of that, even the, let's suppose, infected or the dangerous microbes that have infected your body, let's suppose you are infected by the influenza virus, etc. Now, regular popping in of these antibiotics will make those microbes resistant to the drugs. So the next time when you fall ill, those drugs or those medicines won't work anymore, because your body is now immune to the antibiotics that you have taken. So as a consequence, you will have to be administered a higher dosage and a higher grade of antibiotics. As a consequence of that, the body will take a long-term hit. So that is what we refer to as AMR or antimicrobial resistance. This is one of the most prevalent problems that the world in the 21st century is going to face. We in India are already facing it, because in India you would have seen a very spurious over-the-counter sale of these antibiotics, where people, rather than going to the doctor because it will take a lot of time, because the trust or the faith in the diagnostics is not so much, because the faith in these diagnostic and pathological labs is not so much. So rather than that, they go to the compounder becomes the doctor, they will prescribe the antibiotics, people consume the antibiotics, and long-term damage happens. So this is antimicrobial resistance. If you take a look at it, so inappropriate use of antimicrobials, that is the antibiotics, as a result, even the dangerous bacterium, they develop a resistance to the antibiotics. So as a consequence, in future, the antimicrobials become less effective, the diseases spread more easily. So this is something that has always been indicated, that has always been known, that increased amount of antibiotics usage will lead to more onset of diseases. But then this article talks about another aspect. While it not only harbors more damaging and dangerous bacterials in your body, at the same time, increased and irrational use of antibiotics is leading to what we refer to as dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is when the beneficial microorganisms in the body, they get impacted and their overall population starts dying. Because when we talk about the gut fauna or let's suppose in our guts, in our digestive tract, in our intestines, whatever various different bacteriums are there which help in easy digestion, which help in secretion of beneficial nutrients, now those start dying. As a consequence of that, the entire body starts suffering. For example, there is a direct gut to brain interaction whereby the neurotransmitters associated, they get impacted, because once the digestive system gets impacted, that will impact the brain's functioning as well. And that is when lethargy, that is when you have various different aspects of slowing down of responses and other aspects, they begin to show up. Not only that, people also end up, because they lose the gut fauna, what we refer to as the gut fauna are basically the microbes found in the digestive system, beneficial microbes in the digestive system, Now here, these microbes, when they start getting eliminated, at that point of time, you will observe that this gut fauna, once they die, the digestion slows down. As a result of that, people also develop irritable bowel syndrome, where even the excretion mechanism of the body, that gets impacted. Then you also sometimes develop the leaky gut syndrome, whereby you have the toxins from the intestines, they leak into other organs, impacting the other organs as well. Oftentimes, that lack of complete digestion and the breakdown of the toxins leads to the impact in the liver as well. And that is when people start suffering from fatty liver, the non-alcoholic fatty liver kind of a disease. Now, this is very prevalent right now in our country, where various different researchers have indicated that in our country, fatty liver and diabetes are one of the most significant prominent non-communicable disease problems that is present. Then irritable bowel syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver, leaky gut. At the same time, there is also a development because of these microbes, the beneficial microbes. These beneficial microbes are also present in our reproductive tracts. And as a consequence of these antibiotic consumption, these beneficial microbes die. What these microbes would ideally do, they would fight against infections. But the consumption of antibiotics, what it has done, it has killed those microbes. So now, even your reproductive tracts and your reproductive organs, they are more liable to infections. They are more prone to infections. So that is when you have UTIs, urinary tract infections, vaginal infections become more common. Then the beneficial microbes which are present on the skin, they disappear, so the skin becomes more prone to various different infections, lesions which are created, and also respiratory infections, because there also the beneficial microbes die. So overall, what this article establishes is that dysbiosis is created. Dysbiosis is imbalance within a community of microorganisms. So this dysbiosis is created by irrational consumption of these antibiotics, and as a consequence, the body gets damaged, right? So here, the body gets damaged due to increased consumption of these antibiotics in two ways. One is you become more prone to diseases, and secondly, the internal functioning of the body gets impacted due to dysbiosis. So these are the two impacts. What can be done? Over-the-counter sale of antibiotics needs to be controlled. Then prescription must be made mandatory. Regular checks need to be carried out. Now, countries like India, they have also initiated the Red Line campaign, where basically those particular antibiotics or those particular medicines which belong to the category of antibiotics, they have a red line on the sides of the tablets or on the side of the packet of the tablets. Now, such kind of tablets should be sold only after medical prescription, and complete dosage and complete course of those antibiotics need to be completed, right? So this awareness campaign is very important, at the same time, one needs to carry out a greater study to understand the depth of the problem which is prevalent all across. So, the way forward, prescription should be made mandatory, right? Then the red line campaign should be followed more religiously. Then awareness programs are required. Awareness programs by the government, by the NGOs, they are very much required. Then other than that, over the counter sale needs to be stopped. Counter sale of antibiotics need to be stopped. Right. So, as a consequence of that, or how do you stop it? By carrying out more checks and execute. It is an execution problem. So, more checks and randomized checks by the enforcement agencies at the medicine shop, so that you don't have these kind of activities, because the overall health declines. And you have to understand that this spreads across the community. The antimicrobial resistance spreads across the community as well, because let's suppose through our own body you get impacted and you have these drug resistant microbes which have been developing in your body. It can happen that these drug resistant microbes can then be transmitted from your body to any other individual, and it can be a community spread. Now, even if an individual who has not taken those many antibiotics, they will also suffer from the same extent. So, that is why to prevent the community spread, greater study, greater research is needed. Okay? Now, let us take a look at the question. What is meant by antimicrobial resistance? Discuss the impact of the unsustained use of antibiotics on human health. So, here in the intro you have to talk about antimicrobial resistance. What is meant by this antimicrobial resistance? So, it is the natural resistance developed by the pathogens as a result or as a consequence of continued and unsustainable use of antibiotics. Draw the flowchart that we have indicated in the image immediately after the introduction. Then in the body, talk about the impact. Now here in the body, when you talk about the impact, immediately what you can do to make your answer a bit more presentable is here, again use the bubbles here. One is disease prone, about the diseases, right? And the second, talk about the damage due to the destruction of the beneficial organism, that is dysbiosis. Talk about dysbiosis. Okay. And here after that, draw the or use the point subparagraph manner. Write diseases and explain a couple of paragraphs or couple of sentences about it, and then dysbiosis and then the impact. Now, because it is a 10 marker, there is no scope for providing a way forward. So, way forward you can provide only in the region of the conclusion. So, there while writing the conclusion you can talk about that this antimicrobial resistance needs to be prevented from a community spread by carrying out a greater research and increasing the amount of awareness that the population has and improving the checks and balances in the prescription and consumption of the antibiotics. That can be your conclusion here, because it is a 10 marker. Had it been a 15 marker question, then you would have had a scope to talk about all these way forward and eventually talk about prevention of community spread as well. Okay? Now, then moving to the next article. Next article talks about record temperatures in Great Barrier Reef seen in the last decade. Now, there has been a research which has been carried out which talks about the fact that based upon the corals in the region and a history of temperature data has been calculated going back almost 400 years. What that has indicated is that the sea surface temperature would be quite normal and regularized from up till the 1900s. After the 1900s, the temperature of the water body has started increasing quite rapidly, and this has induced many of the marine heat waves. These marine heat waves have induced various different mass bleaching events where the corals, they get bleached at a mass scale. So first of all, let us understand what are marine heat waves. So when we talk about the marine heat waves, basically when the sea surface temperature rises quite significantly or departs from normal condition quite significantly for a longer duration, that is a marine heat wave. Where when we are talking about the departure of temperature, let's suppose the average temperature is around 25, it has increased to 28 for a duration of almost 3 weeks or 4 weeks or even 2 weeks. That is a heat wave. You have to understand that the thermal tolerance of the organisms in the marine ecosystem is less. The thermal tolerance of the organisms on the land, it is more, because organisms on the land, they have been used to changing temperatures throughout their evolutionary history. But when we talk about the marine organisms, these marine organisms, they have evolved in a condition where the temperature has been quite consistent. So even a slightest departure in the average temperature can mean that the marine organisms are unable to cope up and they immediately start declining and they start to die. Now the corals are also being impacted by that. So this extreme temperature or heating of the water bodies can lead to extreme weather, because it can create those low pressure conditions which can lead to storms and very high frequency and high intensity storms. Then it can lead to deoxygenation, acidification of the oceans, as the recent State of Oceans report of 2024 released by UNESCO has also revealed. Then biodiversity and habitat loss, economic loss, various different species, they are getting impacted by the marine heat waves. Now, one of the region which is experiencing quite frequent marine heat waves is the region of Western Pacific. Western Pacific. In the region of Western Pacific, that is in the area around the Coral Sea, in the region around the Great Barrier Reef, there is an unusual rise in temperature with greater frequency. And that has basically induced significant amount of coral bleaching and mass bleaching events as well. Now you have to understand that what is this coral bleaching very briefly. So when we talk about the corals, these are basically an individual polyp, which is an animal species, right? Contrary to the popular preconceived notion that the corals are plants, they are actually animals. Now these corals, they have the presence of these tentacles to gather food which is floating in the ocean. But then they are not able to have that much amount of food accumulated, because these corals, they are sedentary. They are not mobile. It is not as if they can move through the ocean. So they are still in one place. So as a consequence of that, these corals, they survive in a kind of a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic means mutually beneficial. Symbiotic relationship. And that symbiotic relation is with the algal species, that is zooxanthellae. Xanthellae. Now this zooxanthellae, which sticks on, as you can see, on the tentacles of these corals, that zooxanthellae provides it the vivid coloration. And that zooxanthellae gets its nutrients from the corals. That is the benefit of it. And then it is able to carry out photosynthesis. Being the algal species, it carries out photosynthesis and produces food. Now that food is then utilized by the corals and the other species in the marine ecosystem. That is why the corals and the relationship between the corals and zooxanthellae, this combination not only produces oxygen in the marine waters, but at the same time, how oxygen? Because zooxanthellae carry out photosynthesis, and end result of photosynthesis is production of oxygen. At the same time, they consume excess carbon dioxide in the ocean also. So not only do they enrich the oceanic region with oxygen, but at the same time the food that they provide, that provides necessary food and shelter for a wide range of species in the marine ecosystem. That is why the corals are also sometimes referred to as the tropical rainforests ecosystem, or analogous to tropical rainforest of the underwater world, based on the number of species that they harbor and the oxygen that they provide. Having said that, these zooxanthellae or these corals, whenever they experience harsh conditions or stressful conditions, like let's suppose excess amount of heat, excess amount of warming, increased temperature, increased pollution, increased amount of sedimentation, unsustainable level of fishing leading to uprooting, any of these stressful activities that happen, sudden rise in sea surface temperature beyond 26-27 degrees Celsius, immediately they become stressed. The stress level increases. When the stress level increases, as a consequence of that, what happens? The zooxanthellae, they start leaving this particular coral structure. So the zooxanthellae, they are expelled by the corals during this condition, during these mass bleaching events. The corals simply expel them. So as a consequence, now these corals, they appear stony white. The color that they have, natural color that they have, because of large amount of CaCO3 or calcium carbonate that these corals have. So when they have expelled the zooxanthellae which provided them with vivid colors, now they become stony white. As a consequence, now that they don't have enough materials to gather food, so the corals, they start to die. So once the corals die, that entire ecosystem in the region also gets impacted, because corals are belonging to a category what we refer to as the foundation species. Foundation species. They lay the foundation for the entire ecosystem. They are also a kind of an indicator species, which gives you an idea about the health of the oceanic ecosystem. So once the corals, they start dying in mass, we refer to it as a mass bleaching event. Globally, we have reached the 5th mass bleaching event quite recently. So the amount of coral bleaching has been increasing in the past century, and more particularly so in the region of the Great Barrier Reef. Okay, so what can be done? Lower the level of warming of the oceans. When we lower the level of warming, bleaching will reduce, marine heat waves will be reduced, and understanding the pattern in significance of the distribution of the corals which are getting impacted more, so that if required, we can preserve some of these corals, maintain the genetic biodiversity within these corals, and monitor them on a day-to-day regular basis, the sea surface temperature, etc., so that wherever required, even if artificial interventions can be done, we are able to do so. Okay? Now, after that, moving to the next article. Now, this article talks about Saudi's new law to aid the migrant workers, and will that really benefit the migrant workers? So, as you could have seen in our country as well, and in many other associated the subcontinental nations, large amount of people, they migrate to the Gulf countries to work as domestic workers. Domestic workers at the household level, domestic workers as drivers, etc. Saudi Arabia is one of those key hubs or destinations where a lot of these workers, they go to find some jobs, to find some employment. Now, as per reports, Saudi Arabia in itself has got close to around, the entire GCC has got many millions of workers. Saudi Arabia in itself has around 39 lakh migrant domestic workers. Migrant domestic workers, MDW. Now, these migrant domestic workers or MDWs, Now they have faced exploitation quite significantly for a very long period of time, because you see, understand the system, how it works in Saudi Arabia, so that you will be able to understand the entire predicament faced by the workers. Now, first of all, these domestic workers, they are not covered under the various different labor laws which is present in the Saudi Arabian region. As a result of that, the minimum wage, the minimum working hours, payment for overtime, that is something which is not provided. And the procurement of these workers, for example, let's suppose you have to hire these workers, it is a costly endeavor. Close to around $2,000 to $5,000 is something that a family has to spend to get these workers. Now understand that there is already a patriarchal setup in the region of Saudi Arabia and other regions of the Gulf countries as well. There is a patriarchal setup where it has been always understood, or as is the case of the patriarchal setup in various parts of our society as well, where it is still understood that the chores or the work at the household level is the work of a, or duty or the responsibility of a woman. Now this article argues that as the conditions have improved, the economic wealth has been generated in the Gulf countries, all of them have become significant amount of prosperity has prevailed in the region. Now when the families have become prosperous, patriarchy still remains. Patriarchy remains means what? The household work, the household chores, they are considered to be at a lower level and not respected. They are considered to be menial jobs. On top of that, a family spends around $2,000 to $5,000 to get these domestic workers. So they feel that we have got this worker after spending $5,000 to do the menial jobs. So that means we own this individual, and that is where the exploitation begins. To add on to the fact, let's suppose any individual goes missing, any individual wants to escape that amount of abuse. That is when you had the situation where you can always, the employers could always file cases of absconding individuals or hurub, and that is when various different punishments would be given to the domestic workers. But the domestic workers also face a predicament, and that is due to the existing kafala system. Now in the kafala system, what happens? That let's suppose you are an employer, let's suppose, and you have hired a worker. Okay. Now you are providing the job to the worker, so you will provide the worker some money as well and job as well. Now while that worker is working for you, you will seize all the travel documents, that is the passport, the visa, etc. documents, or even legal documents. Everything will be seized. Right. So as a consequence, the workers' travel documents, legal documents, when they are seized by the employer, the worker cannot move out of the country. So that is when the employer unleashes the hell of various different types of exploitation, and the worker has to face it. If the worker tries to raise an alarm, oftentimes the exploitation increases. Sometimes when the worker tries to escape, that is when the absconding cases are filed, and under the system of hurub, that is when you have very strict action taken by the authorities on whom? On the worker. So that is where across the entire world, various different Human Rights Watch and various different NGOs, they have been continuously raising the plight of these workers, that they need justice, there needs to be some amount of rights given to these workers. Now owing to that pressure and owing to the awareness of its image as well and the rights of the workers, Saudi Arabia has come up with a series of various different legislations and improved labor laws. As a result of that, you have maximum 10 working hours a day, which is prescribed, weekly off, which has to be given to the domestic workers, prohibition of confiscation of identity documents, which can be very, very beneficial if it is executed. And that is a key point. Workers' right to communication. Oftentimes, the workers, they are not allowed to even communicate to their families that they are being oppressed or what is their conditionality, etc. Compensation for unjust termination. 1 month paid leave annually, annual ticket home, and insurance to be provided by the workers as well as provided by the employers at the time of procurement of the workers or hiring of the workers itself. So while this is being touted as a significant amount of reform in Saudi Arabia, and many of the organizations have also hailed it as a victory for the MDWs, but you have to understand that the problem lies in the execution and implementation. The reportage of these exploitation and the crimes, that in itself is not very strong. And if it is implemented, when it is implemented, it will have a significant impact on India. Because a lot of Indian people and Indian immigrants, they go there and they basically work there. Few in the skilled sector as drivers, as workmen, and majority of them as domestic household help. So that is where it is of a very significant benefit to us, but at the same time, the Indian diaspora, at the same time, one has to ensure that regular follow-up and regular execution is done. So this is the Saudis' new law for the migrant domestic workers. We have seen what are the problems existent under the kafala system, existent for the various domestic workers, where the various labor laws are not practically implementable on them, and what the new laws entail, what can be done going ahead, better execution, okay, and better transparency to be maintained, and the impact on India, because India has a large amount of workers going to Saudi Arabia, okay. Now, after that, we move on to the next article, and this is an article in continuum to the Bangladeshi crisis, the turmoil in Bangladesh which has been brewing up. So how will Sheikh Hasina's exit impact India? Now, Sheikh Hasina, presently, who is in India right now, she had been at the helm of power in Bangladesh for quite some time. And since that point of time, Indo-Bangladeshi relationships have thrived. You see, before Sheikh Hasina, when you had the BNP under Khalida Zia from the period up till 2006, India had a very bitter experience with Khalida Zia. You had Pakistani intervention in the region of Bangladesh. You had increased amount of radicalization in Bangladesh. Bangladesh became a hotspot for terrorist modules. Bangladesh became a hotspot for religious extremism. Various different absconding terrorists from India who would carry nefarious activities in the northeastern region, they would find safe refuge in Bangladesh. Bangladesh would allow the illegal smuggling quite significantly. Now, after Khalida Zia government was replaced by Sheikh Hasina, since that point of time, that heralded a new era of better relationship between India and Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina, for example, immediately went ahead with an increased crackdown on the terrorist organizations, the terrorist modules. She cracked down on the various radicalization programs being carried out in Bangladesh. She cracked down and busted those escapades or those particular vital sanctuaries that the terrorists would utilize. She cracked down even on the fake currency mafia in the region of Bangladesh, which would pump in a lot of fake currency into India. She normalized the border relationship and agreed upon and resolved the border dispute that she had or Bangladesh had with India. She improved the connectivity through border hearts, improved the trade with India, resolved the various different sticking points at the various different border points, ensured that India is a favorable nation, ensured that basically Bangladesh is able to walk up the economic ladder. At the same time, reciprocation from Indian side also happened. since the prime ministership of Dr. Manmohan Singh and followed by the prime ministership of Narendra Modi. In both the governments, Indian government has basically, or the central government has extended the line of credit to Bangladesh, provided easy credit and easy loans as well. At a time when Bangladesh was virtually ignored by the international community as being a basket case of economic turmoil, India extended its arm of support and thereby improved the economic condition, helped improve the economic condition of Bangladesh. Now that the Sheikh Hasina government has been removed, now that Sheikh Hasina herself is in India and the new caretaker government, a new regime has come into power, what will be the impact on India? So that is the aspect of this article. So here, first of all, impact of the Sheikh Hasina government. Crackdown on terror camps, campaign against radicalization, then ending border tensions, border trade through hearts, and on India's side also, increased credit line support, increased trade activities, resolution of border dispute through the land border agreement which was done. So there was a good bonhomie and improved relationship between India and Bangladesh. Having said that, when you have the new regime, now while the Indian government has established a relationship with the new regime, Indian government finds itself in a kind of a fix. Why? Now, while on one hand, you had the High Commissioner attending the swearing-in ceremony of the new caretaker government, but at the same time, the anti-India sentiments on the streets of Bangladesh are at a crescendo, at a new high. Now, India right now is being seen as a country who is harboring Sheikh Hasina. Right now, Sheikh Hasina is the biggest villain that the Bangladeshi society is seeing. India being a country who is harboring Sheikh Hasina does not put India into a favorable light. And that is what has been made apparently very clear by Mohammed Yunus. Even when you had the various interviews before swearing in, the new head of the caretaker government had announced on various platforms that he is not particularly pleased with India providing a kind of a safe haven. So that is one of the predicaments. Other aspect is that now there are increased chances that, for example, BNP under Khalida Zia, they can win the elections. When the elections are held, BNP can win the elections. And as history has indicated, whenever BNP wins the elections, it leads to increased cases of radicalization. Various groups of or various organizations like the Jamaat Islami, they become very, very prominent and they fuel the anti-India sentiments. Now, while at the time of Sheikh Hasina government, when you had the visit of the Prime Minister, at that time also, if you recall, you had significant amount of anti-India demonstrations. But the Sheikh Hasina administration came down particularly hard on the protesters and curbed down that amount of protest against India. And that made the visit successful. Now, Khalida Zia government historically has not been known to do that. She ideologically adheres much closer to the principles advocated by Pakistan. That has been the historical experience. So chances are that volatility in the region is going to increase. Chances are that the anti-India sentiment in the region is again going to simmer up and is again going to increase. And that is where India will have to perform one of the best balancing acts out there. You see, our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, when he issued the statement, he used the word that Sheikh Hasina is staying here temporarily. That means even India is expecting her to leave as soon as possible, wherever possible. But till that point of time, India is seen to be as in a kind of a cahoots or in a kind of a partnership with Sheikh Hasina. Then even foreign interventions in Bangladesh is going to change. For example, the US. Now US, as various different news reports have been circulating for the past week, that the CIA has been behind all this. Now US, for the past year or so, they had started this new visa policy where they would not provide visa to the Sheikh Hasina government officials. It was a kind of an informal sanction informal sanction imposed in the sense that US saw the Sheikh Hasina administrator as one of the authoritarian regimes who is curbing democracy. So those officials would never get visa. So now the role and the increased role of US, China, for example, shared a good relationship with Sheikh Hasina government. However, in the last few months, that relationship soured. So China will also try to improve, and Pakistan will also try to make inroads. So on the foreign policy front also, there are going to be the challenges, but at the same time, there are going to be challenges at the domestic front, particularly because we share the longest border with Bangladesh. And be it smuggling, be it the fake currency, be it the cattle smuggling, the smuggling of other goods, fake currency, even the terrorist activities and the groups who are notoriously known in various different parts of northeastern part of the country to disturb the peace and peace conditions in northeast, those groups can also be encouraged. Right. So that is why in the new regime, India has to carry out a kind of a balancing act. Okay. So what have we seen? The benefits created by the Sheikh Hasina government and the good bonhomie shared between India and Bangladesh, and what the impact of the new regime is going to be. Now, after that, we come to some of the articles relevant for your prelims. Now here, we will take a look at some of the articles which have been in news. First of all, why are India's Gaganyatris going to the International Space Station? Now, this is a follow-up to the news article which told us that couple of Indian Gaganyatris, that is the astronauts, they have traveled to the US and they are going to travel to the International Space Station. Now, as a part of the Axiom 4 program. Axiom 4 program. Now, this Axiom 4 program basically is this Axiom programs, they are private sector programs in order to improve or commercial space travel, in order to basically carry people to and fro to the International Space Station. Eventually, the goal of the Axiom program is set up a commercial space station which is going to be global. But here, this travel or this movement to the International Space Station by the Indian astronauts is a part of the agreement between India and the US, where there was an agreement signed last year between Joe Biden and Narendra Modi. Now, that agreement talked about training of the Indian astronauts and ensuring their visit to the International Space Station to gain a better idea of the machinery, working and even piloting of the vehicle towards the International Space Station. Now, what that would mean is that for our own Gaganyaan mission, where we intend to send Indian astronauts into space on board an Indian launch vehicle, now our Gaganyaan mission, for that these astronauts will require or will gain much required experience. So that will help us in our own space program. Now, these people, these individuals, these two Gaganyatris or astronauts, they would basically travel to the International Space Station by the SpaceX launch vehicle, and also on top of that SpaceX launch vehicle, you will have the Dragon crew module. So, Dragon crew module, that is again by SpaceX, right? That is how they will be traveling. And the purpose of it is to benefit our own Gaganyaan program. Now, then Ministry of External Affairs and the commercial branch of ISRO signed pact to assist the launch of Nepal-built satellite. So, Nepal has built a satellite on their own that has been named as Munal satellite. Munal satellite. Now, this Munal satellite developed by Nepal is there, and the prime purpose of it is to study the vegetation cover and the green cover across the world. To study vegetation cover. Okay. Now this satellite will be launched on board the PSLV, and the PSLV, which is considered to be the reliable workhorse of Indian space program. So on board the PSLV it will be launched, and then it will be a significant amount of milestone achieved not only in Indo-Nepalese relationship, but at the same time in helping Nepal achieve its own space ambitions as well. So what you need to know, the Munal satellite is by Nepal. What is its purpose? To be launched by ISRO through the PSLV, and that is why MEA and New Space India Limited, that is a commercial arm of ISRO, they have signed an agreement. Then what has appeared in the international edition of the today's newspaper is the fact that Neelakurinji, that blooms once in 12 years, included in the red list of the threatened species. Now Neelakurinji, a very famous flagship species. It is a flagship species of the Nilgiris. In fact, the Nilgiris, meaning the Blue Mountains, they have gained their name from this famous flower Neelakurinji. Now it is quite significantly famous in the region of the Nilgiri mountains, in the region around Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. It is quite famous. Now this is one of the flower which blossoms every 12 years. That is how this flower basically has been used by many of the tribal communities even to calculate their age. They would calculate their age based upon that in their lifetime how many times have they observed this flower to blossom. So that is how rough calculation of the age would be done. Now you see, these flowers, they are to be found in typical habitat, that is the Shola grasslands. Shola grasslands present in the region of the Nilgiris. Now these grasslands are experiencing increased amount of removal or destruction of these grassland ecosystem. First of all, by building of infrastructure, tourism activities, etc., that has destroyed. But also a significant role in destruction of the grasslands has been the role played by invasive species of plants. For example, you have eucalyptus. Then you have, let's suppose, black wattle. As a result of that, what has happened is that these invasive alien species, they have destroyed the Shola grasslands. As the Shola grasslands are getting destroyed, then slowly and steadily even these Neelakurinji flowers, they are getting impacted also quite significantly. As a result of which there has been a reduction in the numbers. Their numbers has been reducing. And for a long period of time, a detailed study could not be carried out because you had very little amount of idea about what was the spread, in which areas it is actually present. For the first time, this detailed study has been carried out, and that is when it has been put under the vulnerable category of the red list by IUCN. For those of us who are not aware about it, IUCN, or International Union for Conservation of Nature, is an international body which was set up way back in 1948. And in 1964, they came up with the red list. Now, in that red list, they classify the species based upon what is their threat level. And for example, if they are critically endangered, if they are endangered, vulnerable, threatened, like that, or if there is no data. So like that, classification is done in order to improve the awareness and improve the amount of conservation and protection provided to them. So that is why Neelakurinji being listed as vulnerable can mean there will be better protection also and better awareness as well. So it is a shrub that is found in the Shola forest of the western Ghats of Kerala, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, particularly in the region around Idukki district of Kerala at an altitude of 1300 to 2400 meters. Nilgiri Hills, which literally means the Blue Mountains, got their name from the purplish blue flowers of Neelakurinji that blooms once every 12 years. Particularly in the Idukki district is where they are found in the region. Then The Palyan tribal people living in Tamil Nadu use the Neelakurinji blossoming cycle to calculate their rough age. Besides Western Ghats, it is also seen in Chevroi in the Eastern Ghats, then Sandro Hills of the Bellary district of Karnataka. There also you find Neelakurinji. That becomes vital for your prelims exam. Then after that, a deep drill core unveils new insights into the Earth's mantle. So basically, knowing what is present in the interior of the Earth has always been one of the fascinating areas of geographical science, where scientists through the past century or more have tried to understand what is present in the interior, but they have never managed to manually dig into it. Now, the researchers, what they have done, that in the region of the mid-Atlantic ridge, that is the area where the oceanic crust is thin, so there they have drilled through the oceanic crust and extracted the rocks from the region of the mantle almost for around 1200 meters. Now, this is for the first time that this much amount of rocks from this depth has been extracted. Before that, whatever holes were dug, for example, in the Kola Peninsula, during the era of the Cold War, you had a mine almost of 12 kilometers which was dug. But that was in the crustal region, the continental crust region. This is in the oceanic area where the crust is very thin and the mantle rocks have been extracted. Now, this has thrown new light into examples for even the origin of life. For example, it has indicated that rocks such as olivine rocks. Now, olivine rocks, they belong to the category of ultramafic in the classification of rocks, which means that the amount of magnesium and iron content is very, very high. They are generally present, they are the basaltic kind of rocks to a greater extent. They are to be found in the region of the mantle. Now, these olivine rocks, when they react with seawater, it has been found out that they produce hydrogen. Now, you see, this hydrogen is being produced where? At the base of the ocean, at a depth of around 5 kilometers maybe from the sea surface. So, this hydrogen is trapped at the ocean floor, trapped as hydrates, methane hydrates, and that is when that is seen as one of the important key constituents for the origin of life on planet Earth. And also it has indicated that the crustal spreading, how it is happening, how the heat from the interior is getting transmitted outwards, how newer crust is created. So, in the next few months, as the data is being further analyzed, one can expect newer theories and newer discoveries which can change our basic understanding of the creation of a newer crust, about the evolution of life on planet Earth. So, that is basically the crux of this particular article piece. Then, moving on to the last article, that is gene responsible for prickles in eggplant discovered. So, here by the CRISPR-9 or the CRISPR-Cas9, which is a gene editing tool, CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tool, in the eggplants there are certain prickles which are present. Now, those genes responsible for the prickles, they have been identified as on chromosome 6 and SM log 1 gene, right, SM log 1 gene. Now, this is a gene which is responsible for the development of the prickles on the brinjal. Now, the identification of this gene has basically provided us with a lot of benefits, because you understand the eggplant or the brinjals in general. Now, those eggplants, as the longer the prickles, means lesser consumable item in the eggplant. If you remember the structure of an eggplant, when you have longer prickles, means consumable items are less, right? That is the random structure. So, if these prickles, their size is reduced by identification of the gene, which means that we can have more harvest from per crop, and greater amount of extract every crop. So that is going to be the benefit of it, and it can also help in understanding how to fight the various infections and the diseases which impacts this brinjal. So what is that gene? It is SM log 1 and present in the chromosome 6, and it has been identified by the gene editing technology, that is CRISPR-Cas9, which is used to isolate the genes. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I hope the discussion has been helpful, has been meaningful, and you have added some amount of new information to your existing knowledge set. Do revise the particular portions which will help you in answer writing. In this session, we have covered the static areas also associated with these portion of current affairs. So I hope you have liked the session. If you have liked the session, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.